Picture this. The year is 845. Paris is burning, not metaphorically, actually burning. The Seine is choked with smoke. The Cathedral of Notre Dame, not yet the version tourists photograph today but its predecessor, is surrounded by Viking warriors. They have just rowed 700 miles up the river from the open Atlantic. They have been at sea for 3 weeks. Before that, they spent 2 weeks raiding the Frankish coast in driving winter rain. Before that, they crossed the North Sea in open longships through conditions that would have killed most modern sailors within 48 hours. They have eaten dried fish, fermented dairy, hardtack bread, and almost nothing else for a month. They have slept on wooden decks in freezing temperatures with no shelter above them, except the sky. They have not bathed, not in the way the Frankish nobility they are now terrorizing would define bathing. And yet, every single man standing outside Paris right now is healthy. Genuinely, physically, dangerously healthy. Strong enough to row 700 miles. Strong enough to carry weapons and armor and fight. Strong enough to demand and receive 7,000 pounds of silver from the Frankish king Charles the Bald, who pays them simply to leave. 7,000 pounds of silver, because he cannot stop them. Now here is the question nobody asks. How? How were these men not just surviving, but thriving at a level of physical performance that terrified the most powerful kingdom in Europe? The answer is not what you expect. And it starts not on the battlefield. It starts in the kitchen. To understand why Viking warriors almost never got sick, you first need to understand what was happening to everyone else. In the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries, disease was not a side effect of warfare. Disease was the war. The Byzantine Empire lost more men to dysentery on campaign than to enemy action. Their own records document it. Entire expeditions were abandoned, not because they were defeated in battle, but because their armies were too sick to march. The Frankish armies under Charlemagne suffered catastrophic disease losses every single campaign season. Typhoid, dysentery, infected wounds turning gangrenous within days, scurvy appearing after weeks without fresh food, men who had survived combat dying in camp from contaminated water. The English, the Scots, the Irish, the Holy Roman armies, every major military force was dealing with the same fundamental problem. Their bodies were failing them, and the reason was brutally simple. They didn't understand contamination, infection, or nutrition. Their medical system, based on ancient Greek humoral theory, told them disease came from imbalances in blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. So when men got sick, their doctors bled them. Literally cut them open and drained blood from their bodies. Men who survived the enemy's sword died under their own physician's knife. Now look at the Vikings. Same era, same diseases, same brutal conditions, completely different outcome. The Norse had no formal medical system. What they had was something more powerful. 1,000 years of trial and error, encoded into their food, habits, and rituals. And it worked. Walk into a Viking longhouse in 9th century Norway. Close your eyes. The first thing you smell is not wood smoke, though that is there. The first thing you smell is something sharp, sour, almost aggressive. The smell of fermentation, of living bacteria working on food. Because in a Viking household, almost everything is fermented. The dairy, the fish, the grains, the vegetables, the drinks. Fermentation was not a choice the Vikings made because they understood microbiology. They had no concept of bacteria, no understanding of probiotics. They fermented everything because fermentation was survival. In a world with no refrigeration, no preservatives, no sealed packaging, fermentation was the only reliable way to make food last through a 6-month Norwegian winter. You fermented it, or you starved. But here is what they could not have known. What they were accidentally building was one of the most sophisticated immune support systems. Skyr, the thick fermented dairy product that was a staple of the Norse diet, is functionally identical to what we now call probiotic yogurt, except it is denser, higher in protein, and the fermentation process creates a bacterial culture so robust that it survives the digestive process. Modern nutritional science has spent 30 years trying to understand the gut microbiome, the ecosystem of bacteria living in the human digestive system. The Vikings had been systematically optimizing theirs for 1,000 years, without knowing it. Every morning, every meal, every day. They were feeding the bacterial colonies in their digestive systems with exactly the compounds those bacteria need to function at maximum efficiency. But the fermented dairy was just the beginning. Rackfisk, fermented fish, salt-cured and fermented for months in wooden barrels. Eaten raw or semi-cooked, it delivers an enormous dose of fermented bacterial cultures alongside omega-3 fatty acids and complete protein. Soured grain porridges fermented overnight before cooking, breaking down the phytic acid that would otherwise block mineral absorption. The Vikings just knew that porridge fermented overnight tasted better and kept them fuller. They were making the minerals much more bioavailable, and the drinks, ale, mead, fermented whey called mysa. Every liquid the Vikings consumed on a regular basis was fermented, not primarily for alcohol, but because fermented liquids are safe. The fermentation process kills pathogens that would otherwise make water lethal. A Viking warrior crossing the North Sea was not drinking plain water stored in wooden barrels going rotten in the hold. He was drinking fermented whey diluted with water. Mildly acidic, pathogen-resistant, probiotic by nature. He was continuously inoculating himself against waterborne diseases. But the food was only the first layer. Here is something that will sound strange. Viking children played in freezing water, not as punishment, not by accident, as a normal part of childhood. From the time Norse children could walk, cold water exposure was a daily reality. Cold streams, cold fjords, cold rain, cold morning air on bare skin before the longhouse fire was lit. Cold was not something you avoided in Norse culture. It was something you metabolized. And what that did to their bodies, what decades of regular cold exposure did to Viking physiology, science has only recently begun to understand. Cold water exposure triggers a cascade of physiological responses. The immediate response: blood vessels constrict, heart rate spikes, breathing becomes rapid and shallow. The body goes into controlled stress mode, flooding the system with norepinephrine, affecting mood, focus, and alertness. That is the acute response. But what happens after repeated exposure over months and years is different. The body adapts. The vascular response becomes faster. The norepinephrine response becomes more controlled. The brown adipose tissue, which generates heat, increases. The immune system, repeatedly stimulated by cold stress, develops a faster and more aggressive response to threat. Studies show elevated levels of natural killer cells, the immune system's first responders to infection, and abnormal cell growth. Higher baseline levels of anti-inflammatory compounds. Faster wound healing rates. Lower rates of upper respiratory infection. A Viking warrior who had been cold adapted since childhood was not just tougher in the psychological sense. He was immunologically different from a Frankish soldier who had spent his life in relative warmth. His immune system had been trained, the way a muscle is trained, by a lifetime of controlled stress. And there was another layer. The Norwegian winters served a critical epidemiological function. Cold kills pathogens. Bacteria and viruses that thrive in warm conditions struggle in Scandinavian winters. The seasonal die-off gave Norse immune systems a reset, a period of reduced pathogen pressure during which the body could recover, rebuild, and prepare. The Vikings were not living in spite of the cold. They were being protected by it. But there was a third secret, one that modern medicine has spent billions trying to replicate. And the Vikings stumbled onto it completely by accident. Stop. Before we get to the third secret, you need to understand something. Everything described so far, the fermented food, the cold adaptation, the probiotic gut ecosystem, all of it is remarkable. All of it is real. All of it contributed to Viking immune resilience in ways that are now scientifically documented. But none of it would have mattered. Not one single bit of it would have mattered if the Vikings hadn't also solved the problem that killed more warriors than any disease. infected wounds. In the medieval world, getting cut in battle was often a death sentence. Not immediately, not dramatically, slowly, agonizingly. Over days or weeks, as the wound became infected, the infection spread, and the warrior who had survived the sword died of something invisible. Sepsis, the body's own immune system, overwhelmed by bacterial invasion, turning on itself. Burning from the inside. Organs failing one by one. Modern estimates suggest that across the medieval period, infected wounds killed more soldiers than combat injuries. The sword was survivable. What lived on the sword was not. The Norse sagas describe this. They call it sarfifin, wound fever. They knew it existed. They had seen it take men who had survived battles that should have killed them, and they had found a way to fight it, not by understanding infection, not by understanding bacteria, but by observation, trial, and the ruthless elimination of practices that didn't work. The Viking wound treatment system had three components. The first was honey, raw, unprocessed honey applied directly to open wounds. What we know now is that raw honey produces hydrogen peroxide on contact with wound fluid, a natural antiseptic. Applied to a wound, honey creates a physical barrier against infection, while simultaneously killing the bacteria already present. It works. The second was yarrow, Achillea millefolium, named, according to legend, after Achilles. The Norse called it gulris. It grew wild across Scandinavia. Every Viking woman knew it. Every Viking warrior carried a pouch of dried yarrow on campaign. Applied to wounds, yarrow is a styptic. It slows and stops bleeding. It also contains compounds with demonstrated antibacterial and anti-inflammatory properties. The third component was the most counterintuitive: boiling. Viking wound treatment consistently involved boiling the materials used to dress wounds. They were sterilizing their wound dressings 1,000 years before Louis Pasteur explained why sterilization worked. But here is the dark twist. Here is the thing the sagas don't celebrate. The ones who didn't make it back are not in the sagas. The Norse suffered catastrophic casualties from disease and wound infection on the campaigns that went wrong. The Viking immune system was extraordinary, but it was not magic. It was a system built for a specific environment. Take those inputs away, the fermented food, the cold adaptation, the familiar plants, and Viking warriors were as vulnerable as anyone else. They were not invincible. They were prepared. And that difference is the most important thing the Vikings can teach us. In 2012, a team of researchers at University College London published a paper that sent a quiet shock through the nutritional science community. They had been studying the gut microbiome of populations with traditional fermented food diets, populations in rural Scandinavia, the Caucasus, Japan, and comparing them to populations eating modern Western diets. The difference was not subtle. The diversity of bacterial species in the guts of traditional populations was 2 to 3 times greater than in Western populations. Their immune markers were consistently stronger. Their inflammatory response profiles were healthier. Their rates of autoimmune disease were dramatically lower. They were, in measurable biological terms, more resilient. The researchers were careful in their language, but the implication was clear. Something that traditional populations were doing, embedded in their food culture over centuries, was producing immune systems that modern medicine was struggling to replicate. Something that the Vikings had been doing for 1,000 years, without laboratories, without clinical trials, without peer-reviewed journals. Just observation, tradition, the accumulated wisdom of enough generations to separate what worked from what didn't. Think about that for a moment. A Viking woman in 9th century Norway, fermenting skyr in a wooden vat in her longhouse, had no concept of bacteria, no understanding of the gut microbiome, but she knew, because her mother had known, that children raised on this food got sick less often, that warriors who ate this before long voyages came home more reliably, that the old people were harder to kill than the ones who hadn't. She knew it the way you know things that are true before you know why they are true. In the 21st century, we spend billions on probiotic supplements, cold therapy chambers, and immune support systems. Entire industries have grown up around the discovery that the gut microbiome matters, that cold exposure builds resilience, that the foods our ancestors ate were doing something our modern diets are not. We are rediscovering what the Vikings knew. Not because they were smarter than us, because they had no choice but to pay attention. When the winter is 6 months long and the ocean can kill you and the wound from last month's raid is still healing and there is no doctor, you pay attention. You remember what worked. You pass it on. The Viking warriors who stood outside Paris in 845, healthy, strong, and terrifying, were not superhuman. They were the product of a system built not in a laboratory but in 10,000 kitchens and 10,000 longhouses, across 1,000 years of brutal, unforgiving paying attention or dying Nordic life. The system still works. We just forgot we had it.